quail want some fire, right? They do best if there's fire on the landscape. They need to have that grass burned. And that's been shown across the entire range of quail. It's not just a Great Plains thing. Fire and quail go hand in hand. Welcome to Fins, Fur, and Feathers, the Fish and Wildlife Management podcast at K-State Research and Extension. I'm Dr. Drew Ricketts.
And I'm Dr. Joe Gergen. We're both lifelong hunters and anglers, and K-State Research and Extension specialists who help citizens with their fish, wildlife, and pond management needs. If you've ever had a wildlife or pond management challenge, then this is the podcast for you.
We address common fish and wildlife management problems using a scientific approach to provide proven and practical solutions to the issues that you may be facing.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers. You know, it's that fun time of year. I love the fall time. It starts to get a little bit chilly. I'm already wearing long sleeves because I'm a wuss, but I love those chilly mornings with a cup of coffee, and it makes me think about fire a little bit. You know, having a fire out back or out on some land and roasting marshmallows, roasting hot dogs. But you're going to talk to us about maybe roasting some grasses or forbs. So tell us a little bit about what you're going to talk about today, Drew.
Yeah, well, after we did the episode on managing native grasslands for wildlife, one of our listeners reached out to Joe and said, hey, that's great that we see benefits from a habitat management standpoint, but what does fire actually do to the critters specifically? And so I thought I'd put some information together about that. And I don't think I talk about birds often enough, or we talk about birds often enough since we've got feathers in our title. So we thought we'd throw a little bit of bird content in here too with this episode.
It's always fun, Drew, to get feedback from our listeners, you know, and it's fun to me because you and I talk about things a lot, and we talk about them in one direction, and you know, a lot of our listeners, people that don't do it every day, think about it a different way, and that's fun to kind of know what to chat about. So good topic today. I'm excited to chat about it. So, you know, where do we start? We've talked a little bit in the past about wildfires and prescribed burning. You know, those are kind of the same thing, and maybe they're not the same thing. So maybe we can start there. What is a fire?
Yeah. I think, you know, most of the time when people are thinking about how fires are going to affect things, if they're not in an area where prescribed fire happens all the time, or if they're not somebody who does a lot of prescribed fire, then really the only thing that we have to think about that we might have some experience from, maybe we've seen footage on TV or seen reports in a newspaper or something about fire, is the effects of wildfire. And I kind of wanted to start off by talking about how different wildfires tend to be than prescribed fires. So, you know, wildfires usually occur when we have a couple of different things. One of them is drought, right? We've got dry conditions that result in really low moisture contents in fuel, and that also tends to cause us to have a lot of days where we have pretty low relative humidity. So those two things come together to make highly flammable fuel, and they allow the rate of spread of that fire to be high too if we've got the right conditions to have a high rate of spread. The other thing that we usually have in the Great Plains when we have a wildfire that gets out of control, at least, is we have a lot of wind that's pushing that fire, right? And so when we get those two things together, and especially when we get those two things together in an area where there's not been any prescribed fire, so there's a lot of fuel built up from previous years, or there's a lot of fuel in the form of like eastern red cedar because we haven't had fire that's been keeping those out of the prairie, then we can see really, really, really big fires happen sometimes.
Yeah, I think that idea of fuel you touched on, you know, a lot of people, when we think about fires, it's easy to think, oh, fire is bad, right? But if you don't ever have fire, that increases that amount of fuel, and then what's that do to a fire over time, right? It makes it a lot higher, potentially a lot more intensity, and that's when it would get out of hand and potentially cause a wildfire, or an example of one of the situations where that could happen. So
sure.
So you know, it's definitely happening. We see these high loads. So we can't always control the fuel. What are some things maybe we can control or we should be thinking about when we have these fires, these prescribed fires?
Well, for a prescribed fire, we're going to try and burn when we've got lower relative humidities, and that it's kind of a funny thing to think about, but relative humidity, it's got relative in there, right? And low for somebody who's really experienced with fire might be closer to that wildfire type range of humidity rather than somebody who hasn't done a lot of it. It's also going to depend on what your goals are. So I'm comfortable burning as long as I've got good fire breaks and plenty of water when we're getting down there below 30%. Between 25 and 30%, we're still going to see really good fire behavior. It's going to move around a lot. It's going to do a good job of killing woody plants, or at least top killing woody plants, maybe getting up into the crowns of some of those cedar trees when it's down there in that 25 to 30% range. But that's starting to get down where it's kind of scary, right? So most people are probably going to burn when it's 30% or above for the relative humidity, but there's also a top end of that, right, too. If it gets too humid, then you can't carry a fire, or you're not going to accomplish some of your goals, like trying to top kill woody plants. We're also going to try and burn when the wind is lower, right? We don't want to probably have a prescribed fire if the wind's blowing much more than 20 miles an hour, because that wind really, really pushes the fire and increases the rate of spread. One of the really big fires that we've had in the Great Plains in the last 10 years or so is a Starbuck fire. And during that fire, we had extreme drought conditions. We had an area where there hadn't been much prescribed fire in the last 50 to 100 years. And so the rangelands that were still mostly grass had quite a bit of old grass growth in them. So they had those real flashy fuels, or fuels that are going to burn quickly, that are easy to ignite, right? There was a lot of that out there. And then there was also a lot of rangeland that was starting to transition to forest that had been encroached by eastern red cedar. And so you had that fuel that in those dry conditions, that grass lit, and then it carried a fire up into the cedar trees. And then those cedar trees caught fire, and now instead of having flame heights that might have been, 4 or 5 feet tall at the highest out there in that mixed grass prairie, now we've got 20-foot tall flames in those really big eastern red cedars that were out there. There were some cedars that were 40, 50 years old for sure that were burning in that fire, and there were canopies of those that got lit. So now you're talking about maybe 60-foot or 100-foot flame heights. And now when you've got flames that are that tall and then the wind pushes them, they flatten out, right? And so that preheats the fuel in front of them and really increases the rate of spread. And so, we tend to try and avoid conditions where we can have that catastrophic fire like that happens. And during that fire, there was like 715,000 acres that burned.
Wow.
Between Oklahoma and Kansas. And there was another fire, I can't remember if it was the year before or the year after, that was about as big out in that same general area, and some other stuff that didn't burn. We had another really big fire in north central Kansas a few years ago. So these areas where we don't have a lot of prescribed fire, we can see those catastrophic wildfire events when it gets droughty and high wind.
Yeah, you've mentioned fuel a few different times here, and you need some fuel, right? Or you're not going to have a fire. But if you don't burn ever, you're going to have a buildup of that fuel. So how do you maintain kind of that balance and figure out what to do there?
Yeah, it in the Great Plains, let's say we're talking about grassland, you need to burn often enough that you don't start to transition into that forest, right? So when we transition into that juniper forest, that makes it more likely that you're going to have a catastrophic fire event. But if we're thinking about the more common fuel that we're going to burn, like that grass, it really depends on how much rainfall you get. So how far east or west you are tends to determine how much rain we're going to get in the Great Plains. So how much rain you get is going to sort of dictate the growth potential of your grasses. and also the species of the grass out there, which the species can determine biomass too. But the further east you are, the more likely it is that you're going to accumulate more fuel more quickly. The further west you are, the less likely it is you're going to accumulate fuel quickly, or the longer it will take to accumulate that fuel. And what that sort of drives is how often it should burn, right? How often did it burn historically? And if we think about sort of that historical fire return interval, or how often it burned before there was sort of European involvement or European intervention in North America, in eastern Kansas, we probably burned about every 1.5 to 2 years, or 1.5 to 2.5 years, somewhere in there. If you go way, way out to western Kansas, where it's mostly shortgrass prairie, the fire return interval that was natural out there, and natural is kind of weird here, right? Because as long as there's been prairie, there's been people on that prairie, and those people have been managing that prairie, because when they burned the prairie, the wildlife species like bison and elk were more predictable in their movements. And so it was part of the harvest strategy of the native peoples that lived in the Great Plains. And that natural fire return interval was probably closer to 10 years at the far western end of Kansas. So really, when we're doing prescribed fire, what we're often trying to do is sort of mimic that historic fire return interval so that we can accumulate enough fuel that when it's time to burn, we can burn. Because if you try and burn in western Kansas every year, you're probably not going to have enough fuel to do it. And that's, from a wildfire management standpoint, that's beneficial, right? If we burned it off in the last year or two, and we're grazing it, and we're not overgrazing it, but we're maintaining a lower stature of that grass, then it's less likely that we can see that catastrophic spread of fire and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think we're always trying to keep it from getting to that catastrophic level, and maintaining that fuel, or understanding that fuel, is one of those steps. There are some other things that we can do, and fire breaks, for example, or understanding the wind direction and where to light the fire, always having enough water on hand. So I think if you're not experienced with fire, it can be a scary thing, but it's important. It's, as we talked about previously, it's definitely important for the wildlife, something that needs to be part of your management strategy, or potentially be part of it, right? And so, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about some of the critters. So when we light these areas on fire, what is that doing to the animals that are out living in that prairie, for example?
Sure. So, like, if we think about those catastrophic fires that we had, like that Starbuck fire, absolutely wildlife died.
Yeah.
Cattle died, lots of different species of wildlife, whether we're talking about mammals or birds, quail, all kinds of critters that can typically escape the conditions that we're burning in when we do a prescribed fire, died because of the conditions that were going on, the rate of spread, the flame heights, all those sorts of things. But
very intense and moving really, really fast, right?
Right.
And nothing could get out of the way of it.
Yeah. But when we avoid those kind of conditions and we do prescribed fires, a lot of the fire that we do is dormant season fire. So that fire oftentimes is occurring sometime between February and the middle of April, before that grass starts growing, after it's good and dead. We're a lot of times that fire is occurring so that we're preparing to put cattle out there, right, and see higher rates of gain in the cattle. And when we burn during that dormant season, we've got birds out there that can fly. We've got deer that can run. We've got lots of critters like coyotes and those sorts of animals that can run. And the vast majority of those critters escape the fire. I mean, there's very little direct mortality in these intentionally set grassland fires that are managed of those kind of species. There would be more direct mortality of some of the small mammal species that nest above ground. Most of the species that get in burrows below the ground aren't really affected by that fire passing over. They're more affected by the habitat changes that happen afterwards, as are the critters that can get out of the way of the fire. But there's a few of those small mammal species. If we had a pretty big fire that was moving fairly quickly in some places, then yeah, there's going to be some direct mortality of a few rabbits and those sorts of critters. As we move more into the growing season, that's when we start to see more direct mortality from fires. So just from my personal experience doing fires in the springtime, as we move sort of from that middle of April toward the end of April timeframe and into May, then we start to see some dead snakes out in a burn area after a fire. We're going to see a lot more dead insects and those sorts of things. So we do see some of that. We absolutely see some direct mortality of the bird species that nest early, and not necessarily the adults very often, but more often the nests of those bird species. The really important thing to remember about that is that they can re-nest, and they're also dependent on those habitat conditions that are the result of the fire that killed that nest. One of the things that is important to think about when we're talking about wildlife damage, but that also comes into play here, is that society tends to think about individuals, right? We think about an individual person, or we think about an individual dog or an individual cat. And when we're managing wildlife, we manage populations. We don't manage for each individual. And oftentimes it is the case with some of these management practices that it may be bad for a few individuals, but because of the end result, it's good for a population. And so while we might kill a few turkey nests if we burn at the end of April, fire in general tends to be good for turkeys because of the habitat conditions that it produces, and it usually causes an overall increase in nest survival.
So, it sounds like maybe we want to try to burn earlier. Is that correct? Or is it okay to do a May or later fire, right? What does that look? Is some fire better than none, or is there a cutoff date?
So I would say that this is one of those things where it absolutely depends on the species that you're talking about.
It depends. I love that answer.
Yeah. That's that most common answer in ecology, right?
That's right.
It depends. But generally speaking, if you want to avoid any mortality at all of a target critter or any potential mortality, then burning earlier is better. But it gets complicated. So the critter that I kind of wanted to focus on today, since we're trying to talk about birds anyway, I'm not very good at just focusing on one thing, is northern bobwhite quail. And they're the most popular game bird that there is, right? They're very, very popular species to hunt, and a lot of people are interested in them. They've also suffered drastic declines throughout most of their range in North America, but the Great Plains is actually the area where they're doing the best, and especially in areas where there's still some fire. And we've got a couple of recent studies that look at brood, nest, and winter survival of quail in the Great Plains, and one of those studies gets at your question. So I'm jumping ahead a little bit to get at one of your questions. And part of the reason that this depends so much is that depending on the time of the growing season that a quail nest is initiated, they may or may not put that nest in a place where there's enough fuel there to carry a fire. So one of the things that they saw in a study in southwest Missouri that was looking at a bunch of different things, but prescribed fire and grazing was one of them, was that the earlier nests were in a unit that was going to be burned in August, right? Or that had those characteristics, had the same time since fire than an area that was going to be burned in like August. So those nests that were initiated in like May or early June, okay? But those nests would have had their fate, meaning they either were preyed on, they failed for some other reason, or they hatched within 23 days. The nests that were initiated later, so July or August, those nests were in units that were not slated to burn that year because they had a longer time since fire. So quail are going to select areas that have some previous year's growth if they're those early nests. So those areas that we were going to burn in August that had enough fuel for a growing season fire were too thick for a quail to want to nest in them because their chicks couldn't get out of the nest and get into brood rearing cover in time before they would die from just not being able to traverse that really dense cover.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. So for quail, growing season fire's fine as long as you're burning that stuff that's got a whole bunch of litter accumulated in it from a couple of years of previous growth.
So one of the things we talked about there, you mentioned a couple times, was a fall burn, right? And pretty much everything we've focused on recently has been, thinking about that February through maybe May kind of time frame. So what is a fall burn? Why would we want to do a fall burn?
Well, I'm going to backtrack a little bit. I'm not very good at being guided, I guess, because I want to make sure I say everything that I want to say. But the vast majority of prescribed fire is done during the dormant season, right? That time frame that we talked about.
Okay.
But there's been a growing body of research over the last 20 years or more. And some of this research has at least 20 years of data collection behind it. So very, very well-documented responses have shown that from a plant community standpoint, there's not really much of a difference if you burn any one day of the year over another. So lots of research out of Konza Prairie. That was in an ungrazed system where they did their season of fire stuff, but they saw no statistical difference in the plant community between areas that were burned spring, summer, fall, or winter. And that's a 20-year data set, okay? From a cattle production standpoint, there can be some pretty minor differences. And if we're thinking about wildlife management, the thing that I tell people is the time to burn is when you've got the weather conditions and a crew to be able to get it done. It doesn't really matter to the critters unless you're burning on an extremely large scale where you're going to remove all the cover across a very large area. It doesn't really matter to them when you burn. The reason that it can matter if you're burning on a really large scale is if we burn going into winter and we've got species that rely on that grass for cover, then you may remove all the cover from the area, and that could be detrimental.
And that's where patch burn grazing may come in, even in the off season. We talk about it with feeding, but there may be value in other times of year to kind of divide into patches there and burn a little bit, right?
Sure.
Thinking about that.
Yeah. And that's why I tell people, don't burn everything every year, but burn something every year.
Burn something every year. Well, that's good. So thinking about the quail a little bit, it sounds like, it might, again, individuals might have some negative responses, but as a whole, it's a good thing for them.
Sure. Yeah. And so thinking about, I wanted to talk about two specific studies, two that are sort of at the extreme of what we might see in the east and west of the Great Plains. So one was done out in western Oklahoma, and they monitored nests. So they got estimates of nest survival in grasslands, and during the course of their study, they were able to monitor nests that were in grasslands in areas that were burned this year, all the way out to areas that were burned 4 years ago. So 0 to 4 years if we're talking about years since fire. And the cool thing that they saw was that the highest nest survival occurred in areas that were burned about a year ago. So 13 to 24 months since fire. They saw about the same, just a little bit lower nest survival in that 24 to 36 months since fire. And they saw the lowest survival in the 3 to 4 years since fire, and then the 1 and 2 years since fire. Or excuse me, the 0 years since fire, the stuff that burned this year. So that shows a couple of things, right? One of them is that quail want some fire, right? They do best if there's fire on the landscape. They need to have that grass burned. And that's been shown across the entire range of quail. It's not just a Great Plains thing. Fire and quail go hand in hand. They're important. But they don't want to nest in the stuff that we burned this year if they can avoid it, and they don't want to nest in stuff that hadn't been burned for quite a while. They also saw that the quail that did nest in the areas that were burned this year nested around shrubs, and the quail that nested in areas that were longer time since fire nested away from shrubs. They nested in that herbaceous cover. So that's kind of a cool thing that they found too. And so that really reinforces to me that we need fire on the landscape for this bird.
Yeah, and they're shifting their behavior based on, how much fire is there. It's a really cool thing to think about. But good evidence that fire is definitely helping these populations and important to them.
Yeah.
What you said there were 2 studies that you mentioned. What did the other one find?
Yeah, so the other one's out of Southwest Missouri. We talked about that a little bit when we were talking about something else a few months ago, but they saw a really, really strong response of broods. So that's these chicks that have hatched this year. They're trying to grow up, and they need, I think we probably talked about it when we were talking about managing grasslands, but they need cover that would pass the tennis ball test. Okay, so that's where
is that an official test?
It is. That's the official test that all quail biologists will talk about. It's one of them that involves a athletic ball. There's several. The tennis ball test is where you can drop a tennis ball on the ground, and you could roll that around with your foot because the vegetation right at ground level is sparse enough to allow you to roll it, but you would have taller plants that are like brushing up against your thighs as you're walking around and rolling that ball, and you wouldn't be able to see the ball very well from above. So there's going to be lots of insects in that kind of cover. It also provides protection from predators that might try and come in from above and kill those chicks. Okay, so that's cover that would pass the tennis ball test. That's what broods need. And in that study, they found that brood survival increased from 21 to 84% as the availability of burned and grazed prairie increased within 50 meters of a brood's home range.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean that's a really strong relationship.
That's a big change.
Yeah, and they saw basically the same effect with fire by itself, but most of their prairie was in that patch burn graze system, and so that burning and grazing together worked synergistically, and had the strongest effect. Another thing that study found was that winter survival, and this is adults and broods combined, was higher as quail were able to be farther from trees. So from 0 to 200 meters from a tree, survival increased during the wintertime. And that's showing that effect of like hawks being able to perch, right? Being the main predator of quail during the wintertime. And so when we're thinking about trying to manage against trees in prairie, fire is the easiest way to do that. Right? Fire on an interval that's relatively appropriate for the amount of rainfall that you get and the kind of prairie that you're in. There's other ways to do it, of course. We can go out there and we can cut trees down and spray the stumps. But without fire, we're going to have more trees that come in. And then the easiest way to remove those trees without fire is going to be to go through and broadcast spray a herbicide that's going to kill those trees. Well, what else do herbicides that kill trees kill?
Yeah, broadleaves and
Broadleaves. Yeah, they're going to kill all the forbs too, and that's that critical component of the habitat that's out there for those broods. It's providing food for adults. It's providing those insects for the chicks, and it's providing cover for the chicks too. So it's really hard to manage for that habitat that we want in grasslands that aren't tilled without fire, and really without grazing too.
I think that, it's really hard to manage. It's really hard to do any of this, even with fire, I would argue, and that's, I think, a good point there. We were out on my land recently, and that's changed drastically. We've added some fire. We did a little bit of spraying. We've done some management out there, but now we might have the problem of too much grass, right? And so I think the idea when we're talking about this is there's really not a perfect solution. You kind of, you do something, you kind of see how the environment responds to that, or the environment and the animals respond, and then you kind of adapt your strategy. But including fire in that process is important. It's also important not to get overwhelmed when things either go too well or not well enough, right?
Yeah.
I know that we don't want to necessarily focus on too many other critters, but give us a little synopsis of how fire may benefit or potentially harm some other groups. Let's talk about deer or coyotes or, raccoons, possums. What's just kind of a general overview to these trends that we see with the quail carry on to some of those other species?
Yeah, they do. And I don't have as specific a numbers for the other species as I do for this, because I went and looked at some papers and wanted to find some data to talk about for this. But, if we think about white-tailed deer, and specifically white-tailed deer in prairies, they're pretty cover limited. Right, they need to have areas with some tall cover, but they also need areas that are relatively disturbed, because that's where their food's going to come from. Right, so if we're thinking about areas that deer are going to select in a prairie, that let's say it's a dual purpose prairie. We're trying to talk to agricultural producers here, so it's prairie that we're managing for cattle, but we also want to manage for wildlife too there. So that in that system where we're grazing cattle and we burn some stuff and have other acres in that same management unit that don't get burned this year, the cattle grazing is going to stimulate that forb response out in that stuff that we burn this year, and that's going to be the food that the deer eat. Cattle are eating grasses, but when cattle graze those grasses down, we see that forb response, right? And those forbs are not a big component of the cattle diet, but they're the main thing that deer want to eat during the growing season. Yeah, and so that's a great way to provide food for those deer, but the cover that they need is going to be in that patch that we didn't burn this year. So that heterogeneity is there for them. We're providing food and cover at the same time by burning patchily. If we're thinking about something like a coyote, I don't know a lot of people that want to manage 4 coyotes. Most of the people that I talk to are trying to manage against coyotes. But, a coyote is going to bed and rest in a lot of those areas that maybe weren't burned this year, but we're going to see a very diverse small mammal community, which is their main prey base, where we do have patchy fire. The species that they tend to select tend to be in the areas that weren't burned this year. And oftentimes that weren't burned for a couple of years. And so they're another critter that if we've got a diversity of time since fire out there and available, they're going to benefit from that diversity of cover and the diversity of different food sources that are on the landscape too. If we think about a critter like a raccoon, they would benefit from some fire, but they're going to benefit more from allowing it to transition into forest. So, they're a species that has benefited drastically from the fire suppression that we've seen in the Great Plains over the last 100 to 150 years. The increase in woody cover is probably one of the things that has led to seeing a fourfold increase in raccoons in Kansas, since 1980.
So having a plan, I think, is the key there, right? So understanding what are you managing for, what are your goals with the property, and then having a plan. If you're managing for raccoons, which again I don't know many people that are, but you would probably have a different strategy than if you're managing for deer or quail or something. So, I want to interject with fish. I can't let you talk the whole time about terrestrial habitats, but fire. I get asked a lot about ponds. So, what does a fire do to a pond? And most of the time, not much, right? And so the biggest effect that you'll see from a fire is ash. And so if you have a catastrophic fire come through, you can get a bunch of ash dumped into a pond, and that can really, it can cause a lot of things to happen. It can cause the water to clear up, which can lead to overgrowth of plants, and that can reduce oxygen levels and cause issues there. These effects can be seen for miles or kilometers, downstream of these waterways too. So they can be far-reaching, and most of the time, though, those are kind of extreme situations, right? Most of the time, these water bodies are established to deal with a little bit of fire, and they rebound fairly quickly. So my point there, first of all, talk about fish, never miss that opportunity, but I also want to know what happens, what does the rebound process, obviously a fire, if we were to go out there and look at it in a very short, a day or two period, it's a catastrophic event, right? There's not going to be much growth or life there for a short period of time. How long does it take things to start to come back, and what's that kind of recovery process look like?
Sure. So in grasslands, and really any ecosystem, it's going to depend on a couple of things. One of those things is what time of the year did you burn, because soil temperature is one of the main things that drives green up, and that was another reason that historically they lean towards that late winter, early spring time frame, because that would leave bare ground for the least amount of time. And there's a lot of concern about erosion and that sort of thing when we burn that grass off the top. The cool thing about that is it's not the standing grass that's holding the soil in place. It's the roots and the rhizomes, or those lateral roots that plants create. So as long as after you burn, you're not going through there and also, dragging a disc through it or otherwise really disturbing that topsoil, you're probably not going to increase erosion by burning, during a time frame when you're not going to get really quick regrowth on top of it. So if we burn in late spring, you're going to see new green, not late spring, but late winter or early spring, you're going to see new green growth as soon as the soil temperature gets to a point where you can start growing plants again. If you burn during the growing season or even later in the spring, you're going to see green within sometimes just a few days, but usually within a week or two, you're going to start to see a little bit of green. And then that grass is going to grow during the growing season, just like it always does. And when we have good moisture for the area, you can see tallgrass prairie go from 0 inches tall to being 6 feet tall in a growing season. So that recovery process is relatively quick. It takes longer if you burn in the fall, but the cool thing about it is you do start to get some regrowth before everything goes dormant, even if you burn in September or October. And you'll get a few plants that you do see a little bit of green pop up, even if you burn even later than October. But it's okay that sits out there and is bare for a few months during the wintertime. It's not going to wash away. It doesn't mean that you've had total devastation, right? It's going to grow back that year as soon as the growing season starts.
Yeah, it's amazing how resilient Mother Nature is, being able to come back within a matter of a few days or weeks. And that regrowth, that green color is just something that you can't recreate. It's just an amazing color. So Mother Nature's an artist. Well, Well, Drew, thanks for chatting with us about fire today. I think a lot of good information there and a lot of good, tying into some past episodes and focusing it a little bit more on a little bit different direction. That was fun to listen to. So thanks for chatting.
Yeah, absolutely. I enjoyed it.
Make sure that you keep following us along on our YouTube, social media, and other channels. Give us a like. Give us a review. That really helps us with our listeners, and we really appreciate y'all. So thanks for listening, and join us next time on another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers. Fins, Fur, and Feathers is hosted by K-State Research and Extension and is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
The network and this podcast are supported by the Renewable Resources Extension Act.